The morning light filtered through the tall windows of Grosvenor House, casting geometric shadows across the polished parquet floor where Lady Pemberton's private collection awaited its final viewing before auction. It was to be a distinguished gathering, art connoisseurs, society figures, and those whose checkbooks opened doors that breeding alone could not. Among the invited was Hercule Poirot, whose recent assistance in recovering a stolen Degas had earned him the gratitude and curiosity of London's collecting circles. "Mon ami," Poirot murmured to me as we approached the Georgian mansion. "Observe how the windows catch the light, each pane perfect in its alignment. Order, Hastings. In art, as in life, it is the foundation of all beauty." I confess I was more interested in the prospect of viewing the celebrated Whitmore photograph, The Witness at Midnight, which had caused such sensation in artistic circles. The piece, a haunting silver gelatin print, depicted a solitary figure on Westminster Bridge, the clock tower showing 11:30. What made it remarkable was not merely its technical excellence, but the mystery surrounding its subject, a figure whose identity had sparked considerable speculation in the press. Lady Pemberton herself greeted us in the drawing-room, a woman of perhaps 55, with the kind of understated elegance that spoke of old money and older secrets. "Monsieur Poirot, how delightful! I do hope you'll find our little exhibition worthy of your attention." "But certainly, madame. Art, she reveals truth in ways that words cannot." The other guests had already assembled. Sir Marcus Whitmore, the photographer's son and executor of his estate, a nervous man with prematurely grey hair who kept glancing toward the displayed photograph as if it might suddenly vanish. Mrs. Vivian Ashcroft, a striking widow whose late husband had been the subject of recent financial scandals. Mr. Geoffrey Thornfield, an art dealer whose reputation for discretion was matched only by his eye for profit. And Miss Catherine Pemberton, Lady Pemberton's niece, a pale young woman whose inheritance had been the subject of considerable family tension. "The photograph has attracted quite remarkable interest," Sir Marcus was saying, his voice carrying a slight tremor. Father always maintained that truth was the highest art, though I sometimes wonder if he understood the consequences of such devotion. Mrs. Ashcroft laughed, a sound like crystal touching crystal. "Truth is such a relative concept, don't you think? What matters is what people believe they see." As we moved toward the photograph, I noticed Poirot's attention was caught not by the famous print itself, but by a smaller frame nearby, a family portrait of the Pembertons taken some years earlier. His eyes narrowed slightly, and I saw him make that small adjustment of his tie that always indicated his interest had been piqued. "Lady Pemberton," he said suddenly, "this charming family photograph, when was it taken?" "Oh, that old thing. Christmas of 1922, I believe, just after my brother returned from India. Ah, and the gentleman in the background, partially obscured by the shadow." Lady Pemberton's composure flickered for just an instant. "I'm afraid I don't recall. Some family friend, no doubt." But Poirot had already moved on, seemingly satisfied, though I caught him glancing once more at the Whitmore photograph with renewed interest. It was then that young Miss Pemberton approached the display case with a small key. "Aunt Cordelia, shall I unlock the case for closer viewing?" "Of course, my dear." As the glass door swung open, there was a collective intake of breath. The photograph that had drawn collectors from across London was no longer pristine. A thin, deliberate scratch ran across the face of the mysterious figure on the bridge, as if someone had sought to obliterate the very identity that made the piece so valuable. "Mon Dieu," whispered Poirot, but his exclamation was drowned by Lady Pemberton's cry of distress. "It's ruined. The photograph is destroyed." Sir Marcus stepped forward, his face pale. "But this is impossible. The case has been locked since yesterday evening. Only you and Catherine have keys." Mrs. Ashcroft moved closer, her eyes sharp with interest. "How very curious. One might almost think someone wished to prevent the photograph from being sold. Or," said Poirot quietly, his grey cells evidently already at work. Someone wished to prevent it from being examined too closely. He turned to me with that familiar gleam in his eye. Hastings, I believe we are about to witness something far more intriguing than a simple art auction. Indeed, as I was soon to discover, the scratched photograph was merely the first note in a symphony of deception that would test even Poirot's legendary powers of deduction. The outcry that followed the discovery of the damaged photograph subsided under Poirot's raised hand, his authority as natural and unquestioned as gravity itself. Mes amis, we must have order. Lady Pemberton, with your permission, no one is to leave this room until we understand what has occurred here. Lady Pemberton, though visibly shaken, nodded with the dignity that 3 generations of breeding had instilled. Of course, Monsieur Poirot. Mr. Lyle, she addressed the butler hovering near the doorway. Please secure the doors and remain there. Poirot approached the display case with the deliberate precision of a surgeon, his hands clasped behind his back as he studied the damaged photograph without disturbing the glass. Most instructive, he murmured, tilting his head to catch the light at different angles. Observe, Hastings, how the scratch follows the precise contour of the figure's face. This was not random vandalism, it was surgical, purposeful. Someone knew exactly where to strike. But who could have opened the case? Sir Marcus demanded his earlier nervousness now transformed into barely controlled panic. Only Lady Pemberton and Miss Catherine possess keys. Indeed, Poirot replied, withdrawing his small magnifying glass. And yet, see how the photograph has been moved slightly within the case. The dust patterns, they tell their own story. He straightened, his grey eyes sharp with interest. Miss Catherine, your key, where do you keep it? Catherine Pemberton touched a delicate chain at her throat. Here, always. Aunt Cordelia insisted I wear it for security. And Lady Pemberton's key? In my private safe, Lady Pemberton replied firmly. The combination is known only to myself. Poirot nodded thoughtfully, then began his methodical questioning. Now then, let us establish the movements of each person since yesterday evening. Sir Marcus. I arrived this morning from the Savoy Hotel. The desk clerk can confirm my departure time, just after 9 o'clock. Mrs. Ashcroft? The elegant widow smiled with what might have been amusement. I stayed the night, actually. Lady Pemberton was gracious enough to offer me the blue guest room. We had such a delightful evening discussing the collection and old times. I noticed Poirot's eyebrows rise almost imperceptibly. Until what hour, madame? Quite late, past midnight certainly. We were reminiscing about India. My late husband knew Lady Pemberton's brother there, you know. Ah, the brother who appears in the family photograph from 1922? Most interesting. Poirot's tone remained conversational, but I recognized the sharpening of his attention. And Mr. Thornfield? The art dealer shifted uncomfortably. I arrived early this morning to prepare for the viewing. I've been in the drawing room since 9 o'clock, ensuring proper lighting for the displays. With access to this room, naturellement? Well, yes. My work required it. Poirot walked slowly around the display case, his sharp eyes cataloguing details invisible to the rest of us. The implement used was sharp but refined. A diamond, perhaps, or a very fine blade. Tell me, does anyone present have knowledge of photography, the technical aspects? Sir Marcus cleared his throat. I learned from my father, naturally, though I never pursued it professionally. I'm quite hopeless with such things. Mrs. Ashcroft laughed softly. My late husband handled all technical matters. I have some knowledge, admitted Thornfield. One must understand the medium to properly evaluate photographic art. Miss Catherine remained silent until Poirot's questioning gaze fell upon her. I took lessons several years ago. Nothing serious. When did these lessons occur, mademoiselle? During the winter of 1922, just after Uncle returned from India. The silence that followed was pregnant with unspoken implications. Mrs. Ashcroft's eyes sharpened perceptibly, while Sir Marcus appeared increasingly agitated. "Hastings," Poirot said quietly, "would you be so kind as to telephone Inspector Japp? Ask him to come at once, but discreetly." As I moved toward the library to make the call, I heard Poirot address the assembled group with that particular tone that always preceded his most penetrating observations. "What we have here, mes amis, is not mere vandalism, but a deliberate act of concealment. Someone in this room feared what that photograph might reveal. Not to the general public, but to someone specific who would recognize the figure beneath that scratch. The damage was precise, targeted, desperate." He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust motes in the morning light. "You see, the truth about The Witness at Midnight is not merely artistic, it is personal. Someone among us knows the identity of that mysterious figure on Westminster Bridge, and that knowledge has driven them to destroy a priceless work of art rather than risk exposure." The grandfather clock chimed the quarter hour, its measured tones emphasizing the weight of Poirot's words. In that elegant drawing room, surrounded by the trappings of civilized society, I could feel the presence of something far darker, a secret so dangerous that someone had been willing to commit an act of cultural vandalism to protect it. As I reached for the telephone, I wondered what other revelations awaited us in this most curious affair. I returned from telephoning Inspector Japp to find the atmosphere in the drawing room had grown considerably more charged. Poirot stood motionless before the damaged photograph, his small frame radiating an intensity that seemed to electrify the elegant space. The assembled guests remained in their positions like actors awaiting their cue, each seemingly frozen by the weight of unspoken accusations. "Ah, Hastings." Poirot acknowledged my return with a precise nod. "Inspector Japp will join us presently. In the meantime, we shall continue our little investigation." He turned to face the group, his hands clasped with mathematical precision at his waist. "But first, a small matter of practicality. Mr. Lyle, if you would be so kind as to bring that small table here." As the butler complied, Poirot addressed the assembled suspects with quiet authority. "I must ask each of you to place upon this table any sharp implement in your possession, any jewel, any tool, anything capable of creating such a precise mark upon glass." There was a flutter of silk and protest, but compliance followed. Mrs. Ashcroft detached a delicate diamond pendant with a shrug that seemed almost theatrical. I suppose even beauty can be put to ignoble purposes. Thornfield produced a slim penknife and brass magnifier from his waistcoat. Sir Marcus, with visible reluctance, placed a jeweler's loop and silver mechanical pencil on the growing collection. Catherine hesitated before adding a small etui containing fine needles, while Lady Pemberton contributed only a cameo brooch with a blunt pin. Poirot examined each item with swift, bird-like attention, his magnifying glass catching the morning light. "Most instructive," he murmured, then straightened as heavy footsteps announced Inspector Japp's arrival. "Right then, Poirot," Japp announced, his burly frame filling the doorway. "Hastings mentioned some trouble with the photograph. What's all this about?" "More than mere vandalism, mon ami," Poirot replied, quickly summarizing the situation. As Japp bent to examine the scratch, Poirot continued his observations. "Notice, if you will, something most curious about this photograph. The title is The Witness at Midnight, yet observe the clock tower in the image. What time does it show?" Sir Marcus leaned forward, squinting at the damaged print. 11:30, as it always has. "Precisely. So we have a witness at midnight, but photographed at 11:30, a discrepancy of 30 minutes. Poirot's grey eyes gleamed with satisfaction. In photography, as in murder, timing is everything. Mrs. Ashcroft's elegant composure flickered slightly. Perhaps the photographer took artistic license with the title. Perhaps, Poirot agreed smoothly. Or perhaps the witness remained on that bridge longer than intended. He moved to the family portrait he had examined earlier. Lady Pemberton, this photograph from Christmas 1922. You mentioned your brother had just returned from India. What was the nature of his business there? Lady Pemberton's voice carried a note of warning. Monsieur Poirot, I hardly think family matters from decades past have bearing on today's incident. On the contrary, madame, I believe they have every bearing. Poirot's tone remained conversational, but there was steel beneath the silk. Miss Catherine, these photography lessons you mentioned in 1922, who was your instructor? Catherine Pemberton's pale complexion grew even whiter. It was a family friend, someone uncle knew from India. The name, s'il vous plaît? Colonel Ashcroft, she whispered. Mrs. Ashcroft rose sharply from her chair. That's quite enough. My husband is dead, Monsieur Poirot. Whatever you're implying, I imply nothing, madame. I observe. Poirot withdrew his small notebook, and what I observe is that someone in this room knows the identity of the figure on Westminster Bridge. Knows it so well that they were willing to destroy a priceless work of art rather than risk that identity being recognized. Sir Marcus stepped forward, his agitation now plainly visible. Look here, Poirot. This is all very fascinating, but we're dealing with simple vandalism. Ah, but Sir Marcus, you forget. Your telephone call yesterday evening, requesting my presence at this viewing, suggested you had concerns about the photograph's authenticity. What did you suspect? The photographer's son went rigid. I merely wanted expert opinion before auction. Indeed. Then why did you specifically mention your father's private papers, which might shed new light on the photograph's significance? Japp grunted, approvingly. Right then, time for proper questioning. Shall we start with individual interviews? Precisely what I had in mind, Poirot agreed. Lady Pemberton, would you be so kind as to speak with me privately first? The truth, mes amis, is like a fine photograph. It requires proper development in the right conditions. As our hostess led the way to a smaller morning room, I noticed how each remaining person seemed to shrink slightly, as if the prospect of Poirot's individual attention had suddenly made their situation more real, more dangerous. The psychological battle had begun in earnest. The morning room provided a sanctuary from the growing tension in the drawing room, its pale walls and delicate furnishings creating an atmosphere of deceptive tranquility. Lady Pemberton settled herself with practiced grace in a chintz armchair, though I observed her fingers worry the fabric of her sleeve, a small betrayal of the composure she sought to maintain. Now then, Lady Pemberton, Poirot began, his voice gentle yet inexorable. Let us speak plainly about matters that have long troubled your family. The photograph, the witness at midnight. You recognized the figure on Westminster Bridge, did you not? Lady Pemberton's carefully maintained composure wavered like a candle flame in a draught. Monsieur Poirot, I hardly think— Madame, when you first examined that photograph closely, something stirred in your memory. The set of the shoulders, perhaps, the angle of the hat, the particular way the figure stands with one foot slightly turned. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Lady Pemberton's shoulders sagged with the weight of decades-old secrets. How could you possibly know? A sister's eye sees what others cannot, Poirot replied with surprising gentleness. The family portrait from Christmas 1922 shows the same stance, the same profile. Your brother Terence was that witness, was he not? Lady Pemberton rose and moved to the window, her back to us as she struggled with revelation. Terence returned from India in late 1922. He had served there as a diplomatic attaché, but something had gone wrong. He was changed, nervous, secretive, always checking his watch. Ah, his watch. Poirot's eyes sharpened with interest. Tell me about this timepiece, madame. A peculiar thing. It had been damaged during his service and ran perpetually 30 minutes slow. Terence refused to have it repaired, said it reminded him of something important. She turned back to face us, her eyes bright with unshed tears. He was obsessive about time, always calculating, always adjusting for those missing 30 minutes. Poirot leaned forward with that peculiar intensity that made his subjects feel exposed. And this explains the discrepancy in the photograph. The witness at midnight, showing 11:30. Your brother arrived early, consulting his slow watch, believing himself punctual for a midnight appointment. Yes, she whispered, but I never knew what appointment or with whom. Colonel Ashcroft was involved, was he not? Mrs. Ashcroft mentioned her late husband knew your brother from India. Lady Pemberton's composure cracked further. There had been some incident on the northwest frontier. Terence witnessed something, I was never told what, but it involved Colonel Ashcroft. When both men returned to England, there were complications. What manner of complications? Someone else knew about the incident. Someone who began making demands. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Terence spoke of meetings, of attempts to resolve matters quietly. He was terrified that scandal would destroy both families. Poirot's grey cells were clearly working at full capacity. And then your brother disappeared? In the spring of 1923. One morning he simply wasn't there. His valet found a note saying he had gone abroad indefinitely. We never saw him again. She dabbed at her eyes with a delicate handkerchief. The family assumed he had fled his debts or some romantic entanglement. We never spoke of it. But you suspected otherwise. I suspected many things, Monsieur Poirot, none of them pleasant. Poirot stood with sudden decision. One final question, madame. Who else in your household today might recognize your brother in that photograph? Lady Pemberton hesitated, then spoke with obvious reluctance. Mrs. Ashcroft, certainly. Her husband confided his guilt about the whole affair before his death. And Catherine, she was young then, but she adored her Uncle Terence. She might remember his mannerisms, his way of standing. And the photography lessons Miss Catherine received from Colonel Ashcroft. Terence arranged them. He thought it would be good for Catherine to have practical skills, in case the family fortunes changed. The implication hung heavy in the morning air. As we prepared to rejoin the group, Poirot paused at the door. The scratch on the photograph, madame. It was made with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly where to strike. Someone who studied that image very carefully and recognized what others might miss. You think one of my guests. I think, madame, that someone in your drawing room today fears that photograph might revive old suspicions, old questions about what happened to your brother. Poirot's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. The truth has many layers, and we have only begun to peel them away. We returned to find Inspector Japp maintaining order with the comfortable authority of experience. The assembled suspects remained in various states of nervous tension, each lost in private calculations of guilt and exposure. Mrs. Ashcroft, Poirot announced with courteous precision, if you would be so kind as to join me next. I believe you have much to tell us about old friendships and older secrets. Mrs. Ashcroft entered the morning room with the measured grace of a woman who had spent decades navigating the treacherous currents of military society. She settled herself in the chintz armchair with practiced elegance, though I observed her gloved fingers adjust her handbag twice, a small betrayal of the composure she sought to project. Mrs. Ashcroft, Poirot began, his tone conversational yet penetrating. When you first examined the Whitmore photograph yesterday evening, something stirred in your memory, did it not? The figure on Westminster Bridge. You recognized him. Her carefully maintained smile flickered for just an instant. London was full of solitary figures in those days, Monsieur Poirot. One might see resemblances everywhere. Ah, but this was no mere resemblance, Poirot replied, leaning forward with that peculiar intensity that made his subjects feel exposed. The set of the shoulders, the particular angle of the hat, the way one foot turned slightly outward, these details spoke to you of someone specific, someone you knew well. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Finally, Mrs. Ashcroft's shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly. Yes, she whispered. I knew it was Terence Pemberton the moment I saw it, because your late husband described these mannerisms to you in great detail. My husband was a troubled man in his final years, Monsieur Poirot. The incident on the northwest frontier, it haunted him until his death. She rose and moved to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the morning glass. There had been irregularities in the supply lines, missing funds that should have gone to native auxiliaries. Terence witnessed something he shouldn't have. Poirot's grey eyes sharpened with interest. And your husband's role in this affair? He was approached by the commanding officer and given a choice: silence or disgrace. He chose survival, though it cost him his peace of mind. Her voice carried the weight of decades-old guilt. When both men returned to England, Terence began making demands. He possessed evidence that could have destroyed several careers. Hence the meetings at Westminster Bridge. My husband tried to reason with him, to offer compensation for his silence, but Terence grew more agitated with each encounter. He spoke of honor, of duty to the men who had suffered because of the corruption. Mrs. Ashcroft pressed her handkerchief to her eyes. The final meeting was arranged for midnight on March 15, 1923. And after that meeting, Terence Pemberton disappeared. My husband returned home at dawn, pale and shaken. He would only say that the matter was resolved permanently. The implication hung heavy in the morning air. Poirot stood with sudden decision. This morning, when you saw the photograph, you realized that proper identification would revive old questions, old suspicions about your husband's involvement in Terence's disappearance. The scandal would destroy what little remains of our family's reputation. My husband's military honors, his position in society, all would be forfeit if the truth emerged. You had opportunity, madame. You admit to wandering the house after midnight, and your diamond pendant possessed a point sharp enough to score the photograph's surface. Mrs. Ashcroft turned from the window, her composure returning like armor donned for battle. I will not deny I had cause for concern, Monsieur Poirot, but I will say only this. Some secrets are better left buried, and sometimes one must take decisive action to ensure they remain so. As we prepared to return to the drawing-room, Poirot paused thoughtfully. One final question, madame. In March of 1923, did your husband receive any unusual correspondence? Her face went ashen. A packet arrived by post. It contained a photograph and a note that said, "Midnight Speaks." My husband burned the note immediately, but the photograph... She hesitated. It resembled the Whitmore print, but the figure was clearer, more recognizable. And who, in your opinion, sent this packet? Someone who knew the truth about that night on Westminster Bridge, she replied quietly. Someone who has been watching, waiting, all these years. We returned to find Inspector Japp maintaining order with comfortable authority. The assembled suspects remained in various states of nervous tension, each lost in private calculations of guilt and exposure. "Sir Marcus," Poirot announced with deceptive cheerfulness, "I believe it's time we discussed your father's private papers, and the letter you discovered among them just 1 week ago." Sir Marcus Whitmore entered the morning room with the gait of a man walking to his own execution. His earlier nervous energy crystallized into something approaching despair. His hands trembled as he settled into the chair, and I observed him glance repeatedly toward the door as if calculating his chances of escape. "Sir Marcus," Poirot began with deceptive gentleness, "your telephone call yesterday mentioned new information that might affect the photograph's authenticity. You spoke of your father's private papers. What exactly did you discover?" The silence stretched uncomfortably before Sir Marcus finally reached into his breast pocket with obvious reluctance. "A letter," he whispered, producing a worn envelope. "Hidden in a false compartment of father's desk. I found it quite by accident while settling his estate." Poirot accepted the document with the reverence due a piece of evidence. As he unfolded it, I could see the paper bore the distinctive watermark of expensive stationery, though the ink had faded with age. "The date, s'il vous plaît." "March 18th, 1923, 3 days after—" Sir Marcus's voice trailed off meaningfully. "After Terence Pemberton's disappearance. Poirot completed, his grey eyes sharpening with interest. And the author? Father himself. It appears to be a record of events, written for posterity. Sir Marcus swallowed hard. He describes being commissioned to photograph certain meetings on Westminster Bridge. Discreetly. By someone who paid very well for absolute secrecy. Poirot read silently, his expression growing increasingly grave. Finally, he looked up. Your father witnessed something far more significant than a simple rendezvous, did he not? The letter describes how the final meeting, the one on March 15th, went terribly wrong. Father was positioned some distance away with a telephoto lens. He saw Terence Pemberton arrive early, consulting that peculiar slow watch of his. Then another figure approached, someone Pemberton clearly wasn't expecting. And then, Sir Marcus's composure cracked entirely. There was an altercation. Father couldn't hear the words, but he could see the violence of it. The stranger struck Pemberton and he pressed his handkerchief to his eyes. Father believed he witnessed a murder. Poirot set down the letter with mathematical precision. But your father chose silence over justice. He was terrified. The letter explains how he sent an anonymous print to the authorities, but when no investigation followed, he realized powerful forces were at work. He feared for his family's safety. Sir Marcus leaned forward desperately. That's why I damaged the photograph this morning. When I realized it would be publicly displayed, that modern photographic analysis might reveal details Father's generation couldn't see. Ah, Poirot interrupted softly. But you have brought more than merely the letter, have you not? Sir Marcus reluctantly produced a manila envelope. Father made enlargements, specific sections of the negative enhanced to show details invisible to the naked eye. Poirot examined the enlarged prints with the intensity of a jeweler studying precious stones. Extraordinary. Hastings, observe this section. The object in the approaching figure's hand appears to be some form of military insignia. And here, the distinctive gait, the angle of the shoulders. Father's notes identify the attacker, Sir Marcus whispered. But I cannot bring myself to speak the name aloud. We returned to the drawing room to find the assembled company in various states of nervous tension. As Poirot displayed the enlarged sections, I watched each face carefully. Mrs. Ashcroft's elegant composure flickered momentarily. Thornfield leaned forward with professional interest, though his hands remained suspiciously steady. Catherine Pemberton stared at the images with something approaching recognition. These enlargements, Poirot announced to the group, reveal details that transform our understanding of the witness at midnight. What appeared to be an artistic study was, in fact, a document of crime. Inspector Japp examined the prints with growing excitement. Right then, Sir Marcus. Looks like we have our vandal and our motive. You'll need to come with us for a proper statement. But Poirot raised his hand with that particular gesture that always preceded his most penetrating observations. A moment, Inspector. While Sir Marcus has indeed provided fascinating information, I fear we are dealing with something far more complex than simple family protection. He moved to the damaged photograph, studying it once more with renewed interest. The scratch was made with surgical precision by someone intimately familiar with photographic techniques, yet Sir Marcus, by his own admission, possesses only amateur knowledge of his father's craft. What are you suggesting? Japp demanded. I am suggesting, mon ami, that while Sir Marcus may have had compelling reasons to protect his father's reputation, someone else in this room had even more compelling reasons to prevent these enlargements from being examined too closely. Poirot's gaze swept the assembled company with predatory precision. Someone who knew exactly what modern analysis might reveal, and exactly how to prevent it. The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its measured tones emphasizing the weight of Poirot's words. In that elegant drawing-room, I could feel the presence of deeper deceptions yet to be unraveled. The truth, mes amis, has many layers, Poirot continued with quiet authority. And I fear we have only begun to peel them away. The tension in the drawing room was nearly palpable, every eye drawn to Poirot as he began, with his usual meticulous care, to orchestrate what felt less an interrogation than a subtle psychological experiment. He called for a tray with ink, paper, and a tall mirror, arranging them near the display case so that the infamous scratch on the Whitmore photograph was visible in reverse. "Observe, mes amis," Poirot intoned, gesturing to the scratch running from left temple to collar. "The stroke is not random, but practiced. A gesture to erase, yes, but also to conceal. See, Hastings, a right-handed person would make such a curve if they reached in quickly. A left-handed person, a different one. Now, I ask you each, with no thought, to write your name and cross out the first letter, swiftly, as in a moment of annoyance." Each suspect complied, the soft rasp of nibs on paper sounding unnaturally loud. Poirot's eyes missed nothing. Mrs. Ashcroft's line was graceful, descending, Thornfield's terse and efficient, Sir Marcus's blotted with frustration, Lady Pemberton's unexpectedly firm, and Catherine's trembling, her downward stroke eerily echoing the arc of the scratch on the photograph. Poirot examined the sheets, saying nothing, but his lips pursed thoughtfully as he set Catherine's aside. He then turned his attention to Mr. Thornfield. "You adjusted the lighting this morning, did you not, monsieur? Only the bulbs, not the sconces?" Thornfield nodded, but Poirot continued. "Yet I detect a faint scent, chemical, like photographic fixer, on your gloves. A trace perhaps from handling new prints, or from a more specialized task?" Thornfield replied, his tone measured. "I handled the prints, yes. It is a professional hazard, nothing more." Poirot accepted this with a small nod. Then, with a shift in tone, he addressed Sir Marcus. "You mentioned, monsieur, that you brought the original negative of The Witness at Midnight for Lady Pemberton. Might we examine it?" Sir Marcus, still pale from earlier revelations, produced a leather-bound case. Poirot, with utmost care, held the glass negative to the light, his magnifying glass poised. After a long, silent scrutiny, his brow furrowed. "Mon Dieu," he murmured. "Observe, Hastings. Here in the background. There is an area, not scratched, but subtly obscured, as if by chemical etching. The figure of Terence Pemberton remains clear, but the other, indistinct, almost ghostly." A stir of unease swept the room. Lady Pemberton's hand flew to her mouth, Mrs. Ashcroft's fan opened with a snap, and Thornfield's composure flickered just for a heartbeat. Poirot handed the negative to Jap, indicating the hazy patch. "This is no accident. It would require knowledge, access to photographic chemicals, and time alone with the negative. Sir Marcus, you say it was in your possession since yesterday?" "Yes," Sir Marcus replied, visibly shaken. "In my cabinet and with me this morning, but it was here, in the drawing room for a time during the preparations." Poirot's gaze swept the room. Then, anyone with skill and opportunity could have altered it, hoping to erase a truth as damning as any confession. But whether by hand or by mind, such precision betrays both expertise and fear. He arranged the suspect's written samples beside the tray, lingering over Catherine's, then glanced at Thornfield's gloved hands. A professional's touch, a knowledge of chemicals, a familiarity with the artwork's history. These threads, they begin to entwine. The group's anxiety was nearly tangible, but Poirot, with his characteristic composure, only smiled. "There is more to uncover, mes amis. The photograph, she lies, but only a little. The truth, she is ripening. We must be patient, for the moment of revelation approaches." As the grandfather clock chimed the hour, I realized, along with everyone else, that Poirot was closing the circle ever tighter. The game had turned. From overt sabotage to a battle of nerves, every detail, chemical residue, a trembling hand, a hastily altered negative, now a thread in the net Poirot was weaving. The next move would be decisive, and none in that elegant room could escape the feeling that their secrets were at last inching into the light. The atmosphere in the drawing room had grown thick with unspoken tensions, each suspect seemingly frozen in their private calculations of guilt and exposure. Poirot, with his characteristic precision, arranged the handwriting samples on the small table beside the damaged photograph, his grey eyes moving between the scratched glass and the revealing strokes of ink with mathematical deliberation. "Most instructive," he murmured, holding Catherine's sample to the light. The trembling downward stroke bore an unmistakable resemblance to the arc that had destroyed the photograph's central figure. Yet Poirot's attention seemed equally drawn to Mr. Thornfield's controlled, efficient marks, the hand of someone accustomed to precise, technical work. "Now then," Poirot announced, producing his magnifying glass once more, "let us examine what our vandals sought so desperately to conceal." He approached the original negative with the reverence of a surgeon, angling it against the morning light streaming through the tall windows. "Observe, mes amis, how the obscured area was created not with crude scraping, but with chemical precision." I watched as Poirot's examination grew more intense, his small frame radiating that peculiar energy that always preceded his most significant discoveries. "Hastings," he said quietly, "the residue pattern here. It speaks of a very particular technique, one requiring not merely knowledge but years of practice." Thornfield shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Surely any competent photographer might achieve such results. "But, monsieur, this is no amateur work." Poirot straightened, his eyes gleaming with satisfaction. "The chemical compound used leaves a distinctive crystalline trace, visible only under specific magnification. I have encountered this technique precisely once before, in a case involving forged documents of considerable sophistication." The silence that followed was pregnant with implication. Mrs. Ashcroft's fan snapped open with unnecessary force, while Catherine's fingers worried the chain at her throat. Sir Marcus appeared increasingly agitated, his earlier confession having clearly not brought the relief he had anticipated. "The question," Poirot continued conversationally, "is not merely who possessed the technical skill, but who had access to the specific chemicals required. These are not common darkroom supplies, but specialized solvents used in restoration and—" he paused meaningfully, "forgery." It was then that Catherine Pemberton rose abruptly from her chair, her pale complexion now deathly white. "I cannot bear this any longer," she declared, her voice carrying a tremor that seemed to electrify the room. "The photography lessons Colonel Ashcroft gave me, they weren't ordinary instruction." Lady Pemberton gasped. "Catherine, what are you saying?" "He taught me techniques for altering photographs, for making changes that would be virtually undetectable. He said it was for artistic purposes, but now I understand." Her voice trailed off as the full implication of her words settled over the assembly. Poirot leaned forward with that intensity that made his subjects feel both exposed and strangely protected. "Continue, mademoiselle. What did you understand?" "That someone wanted me to have the skills to alter evidence, should the need arise. Someone who feared what that photograph might reveal about events in 1923. Catherine's composure was cracking, 30 years of suppressed knowledge threatening to spill forth. Mrs. Ashcroft's elegant facade finally shattered. "You foolish child, do you have any conception of what you're suggesting?" "I suggest nothing," Catherine replied with surprising firmness. "I merely state what I was taught and by whom." Thornfield rose with sudden violence. "This is preposterous. The traumatic imaginings of someone seeking to deflect suspicion from her own obvious guilt." But Poirot was studying the art dealer with renewed interest. "Your gloves, monsieur, they carry the distinctive scent of the very chemicals needed for such sophisticated alteration. And your knowledge of photographic processes extends well beyond mere appreciation, does it not?" The grandfather clock chimed the half-hour, its measured tones emphasizing the weight of accusations now hanging in the air. I could see that Poirot was methodically tightening his net, each revelation designed to increase the psychological pressure on his suspects. "The truth, mes amis," Poirot announced with quiet authority, "has many layers. We have peeled away the surface deception of the scratched photograph, but beneath lies a far more sophisticated crime, one requiring not desperate vandalism, but cold, calculated expertise." He moved to stand before the assembled company, his small frame somehow commanding the elegant drawing room with absolute authority. "Someone in this room has spent 30 years believing themselves safe, protected by their technical skill and careful planning. But the truth, she is like water, finding every crack, every weakness in even the most carefully constructed deception." The psychological battle had reached its crescendo, and I could sense that the final revelation was now inexorably approaching. The psychological pressure in the drawing room had reached a crescendo that seemed to vibrate through the very walls of Grosvenor House. Poirot, with his characteristic precision, arranged the evidence before him like a chess master positioning pieces for checkmate. The handwriting samples, the damaged photograph, and the chemically altered negative formed a triangle of deception that spoke volumes to his trained eye. "Mes amis," Poirot announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority, "we have established that our vandal possessed not merely opportunity, but specialized knowledge. The scratch was surgical, the chemical alteration sophisticated. But there remains one element we have not yet examined, the element of desperation." He moved to the display case, his magnifying glass catching the morning light as he studied the damage once more. "Observe the pressure marks in the velvet lining, barely visible but unmistakably present. Our culprit worked quickly, yes, but also with the familiarity of previous practice. This was not their first manipulation of this particular piece." Mrs. Ashcroft's fan snapped open with unnecessary force, while Thornfield's gloved hands remained suspiciously still. Catherine Pemberton touched the chain at her throat with trembling fingers, and Sir Marcus appeared increasingly agitated despite his earlier confession. It was then that the acrid scent of smoke began to drift through the drawing room's elegant atmosphere. Inspector Japp's head snapped up with professional alertness. "Fire!" came a cry from the corridor, followed by the sound of running footsteps. We rushed toward the library to find a small but determined blaze consuming papers on the writing desk. Japp smothered the flames with practiced efficiency, but the damage was revealing in its specificity. Among the charred remains were fragments of photographic paper and what appeared to be correspondence bearing official watermarks. "Mon Dieu," Poirot murmured, crouching beside the sodden ashes. "Someone has attempted to destroy evidence while we were occupied with our little gathering. But observe, Hastings. The fire was set with materials readily at hand, yet the selection of papers was precise. Our arsonist knew exactly what needed to disappear." He lifted a partially burned fragment with his penknife, revealing a corner of text that read, "Chemical processes for historical document." The implication was unmistakable. Someone had been consulting technical manuals for sophisticated forgery techniques. "The timing is most instructive," Poirot continued, his gray eyes sharp with understanding. "This desperate act occurred while we were examining handwriting samples and discussing photographic expertise. Someone realized that their specialized knowledge was becoming a liability rather than an asset." Returning to the drawing room, Poirot positioned himself before the assembled suspects with the authority of a judge preparing to deliver verdict. "We have now witnessed 3 distinct acts of concealment. The original chemical alteration of the negative 30 years ago, the precise scratch made yesterday evening, and this morning's clumsy attempt at destroying documentary evidence." He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust motes in the charged atmosphere. "Each act reveals increasing desperation as the truth threatens to emerge. The first required patience and expertise. The second demanded intimate knowledge of the photograph's significance. The third betrays panic and the recognition that sophisticated concealment has failed." Thornfield shifted in his chair, his professional composure showing hairline cracks. "Surely you don't suggest that a simple fire—" "Simple?" Poirot's eyebrows rose with theatrical precision. "Monsieur, the papers selected for destruction included technical manuals for photographic manipulation and correspondence regarding the authentication of historical documents. These are not materials one discards casually." He moved to examine Thornfield's gloves once more, noting the faint chemical residue that clung to the leather despite obvious attempts at cleansing. The specialized solvents required for sophisticated negative alteration leave distinctive traces, do they not? Traces that persist despite the most careful washing. The grandfather clock chimed the 3/4 hour, its measured tones emphasizing the inexorable approach of justice. In that elegant drawing room, surrounded by the trappings of civilized society, I could feel the presence of truth finally breaking through decades of careful concealment. "The fire has revealed something most significant," Poirot announced with quiet satisfaction. "Our culprit possesses not merely the technical knowledge for photographic manipulation, but access to professional resources for document authentication and forgery. This suggests someone whose livelihood depends upon such expertise, someone who has built a career upon the ability to make evidence appear or disappear as circumstances require." The psychological battle had reached its penultimate stage, and I could sense that the final revelation was now inevitable. The acrid scent of smoke still clung to our clothes as we returned to the drawing room, where the assembled suspects awaited us with varying degrees of apprehension. Poirot positioned himself before the display case with mathematical precision, his small hands clasped behind his back as he surveyed the evidence arranged on the small table. The handwriting samples, the charred fragments from the library fire, and the chemically altered negative that had started our investigation. "Mes amis," Poirot began, his voice carrying that particular authority that always preceded his most penetrating revelations, "we have before us not one crime, but a sequence of deceptions spanning 30 years. Each layer reveals increasing desperation as the truth threatens to emerge from its carefully constructed hiding place." He moved with deliberate steps around the perimeter of the room, his gray eyes cataloging every nervous gesture, every betraying glance. The fire in the library was most instructive. Our arsonist selected documents with surgical precision, technical manuals for photographic manipulation, correspondence regarding authentication of historical documents, notes on chemical processes for altering silver gelatin prints. These are not materials one discards casually, but the professional toolkit of someone whose livelihood depends upon such expertise. Inspector Japp cleared his throat impatiently. "Right then, Poirot. Time we had some answers." "Indeed, mon ami. Let us examine our evidence systematically." Poirot approached the handwriting samples, lifting Catherine's with gentle precision. "Miss Catherine, your downward stroke when crossing out letters matches exactly the arc of damage to the photograph. The pressure marks in the velvet lining correspond to your height and reach. You opened the case after midnight and made that desperate scratch with one of your fine needles." Catherine Pemberton's composure cracked visibly. I recognized Uncle Terence immediately. The way he stood, the angle of his shoulders. I thought if his face couldn't be seen clearly, no one would ask questions about what happened to him. A desperate act born of family loyalty, Poirot acknowledged with surprising gentleness, but the sophisticated chemical alteration of the original negative required far different skills, professional expertise developed over decades of practice. He turned his attention to Thornfield, whose professional composure was showing increasing strain. "Monsieur, the residue on your gloves tells its own story. The specialized solvents required for negative manipulation leave distinctive crystalline traces, visible only under specific magnification. I have encountered such traces precisely once before, in a case involving forged documents of considerable sophistication." Thornfield shifted uncomfortably. Surely any competent photographer might. But observe this small detail. Poirot interrupted, producing his magnifying glass and directing it toward Thornfield's ring finger. The white crescent where flesh has been permanently deprived of pigment by a drop of acid. The dark room brands those who live in it, monsieur. This is the mark of someone who has spent years working with the most corrosive chemicals of the photographic trade. The silence that followed was electric with tension. Mrs. Ashcroft's fan snapped open with unnecessary force, while Sir Marcus appeared increasingly agitated, despite his earlier confession. The burned documents included correspondence bearing your letterhead, monsieur, Poirot continued relentlessly. Technical discussions of historical document authentication, methods for subtly altering photographic evidence, consultations on making changes that would be virtually undetectable to casual examination. He paused, allowing his words to settle like dust motes in the charged atmosphere. You see, the truth about The Witness at Midnight extends far beyond a simple family tragedy. Someone has spent 30 years building a reputation for discretion in authentication matters. A reputation that would be utterly destroyed if it became known that they had been systematically altering evidence and creating false documentation for wealthy clients with questionable provenance. The grandfather clock chimed the hour, its measured tones emphasizing the inexorable approach of justice. In that elegant drawing room, surrounded by the trappings of civilized society, I could feel the presence of truth finally breaking through decades of careful concealment. The photograph was transformed from evidence into art, Poirot announced with quiet satisfaction, hiding the truth of what happened to Terence Pemberton behind the facade of artistic expression. But when Sir Marcus discovered his father's letter, when the auction threatened to bring modern analytical techniques to bear on the image, someone realized that their most audacious creation was about to expose them. The psychological battle had reached its crescendo, and I could sense that the final, complete revelation was now inevitable. Thornfield rose from his chair with the sudden violence of a cornered animal, his professional composure finally cracking under the weight of Poirot's inexorable logic. This is preposterous speculation, Poirot. You have no concrete proof of these wild accusations. On the contrary, monsieur, Poirot replied with that peculiar smile that always preceded his most devastating revelations. I have something far more compelling than speculation. I have the truth, revealed through your own meticulous craftsmanship and 30 years of careful deception. He approached the display case once more, his gray eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a puzzle finally solved. You see, when Miss Catherine scratched the surface yesterday evening in her desperate attempt to protect her uncle's memory, she inadvertently revealed something you had concealed for 3 decades. The glass beneath shows microscopic traces of previous alteration, careful scratches where you systematically removed identifying details from the original print before having it professionally mounted. The assembled company leaned forward with collective fascination as Poirot continued his methodical exposition. But your greatest mistake, monsieur, lay in the negative itself. The chemical obscuration was indeed sophisticated, executed with the precision of a master craftsman. However, it followed a distinctive pattern, the same technique you employed when you began your career as a restoration specialist for collectors with questionable acquisitions. Thornfield's face had gone ashen, beads of perspiration appearing despite the morning chill. You cannot possibly connect me to events from decades past. Ah, but I can, Poirot interrupted smoothly, producing the partially burned invoice from his waistcoat. Inspector Japp's men recovered this from the library ashes, chemical supplies ordered last week bearing your signature. The same specialized solvents used to alter the Whitmore negative and the same compounds that leave those distinctive crystalline traces on your gloves. He paused, allowing the weight of evidence to settle over the room like dust motes in morning light. You were present on Westminster Bridge that night in March 1923, monsieur. Not as a casual observer, but as an active participant in the events that led to Terence Pemberton's death. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by Lady Pemberton's sharp intake of breath and the measured ticking of the grandfather clock. The enlarged sections of your father's photograph, Sir Marcus, show something the original observer missed from his distant vantage point. A distinctive walking stick with an elephant head, carving. The same stick that appears in numerous society photographs from the 1920s, always carried by a young man making his ambitious way in London's art world. Thornfield's shoulders sagged with the weight of 3 decades of concealed guilt. Pemberton was becoming increasingly erratic, threatening to expose the arrangement with Colonel Ashcroft unless his impossible demands were met. I was sent merely to reason with him, to offer alternative compensation. But he refused to listen, Poirot observed with quiet understanding. He laughed at me, called me an errand boy for corrupt officers, said he would see justice done regardless of the consequences to anyone else. Thornfield's voice carried the hollow tone of a man reliving his worst moment. When he turned to leave, I struck out in frustration. The blow was harder than intended, and he fell against the bridge parapet. Mrs. Ashcroft pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "Geoffrey, you never told us." "The body went into the Thames," Thornfield continued with mechanical precision. "I convinced myself it was a tragic accident, a moment of uncontrolled anger. But when Whitmore's photograph surfaced years later, I realized evidence of that night would always exist unless I took decisive action." "So you purchased the print, altered the negative to obscure your own image, and transformed evidence into art," Poirot concluded with inexorable logic. "A masterpiece of deception that might have succeeded indefinitely had not modern circumstances threatened to expose your handiwork to contemporary analytical techniques." Inspector Japp stepped forward with professional authority. "Geoffrey Thornfield, I'm arresting you for the murder of Terence Pemberton and the systematic destruction of evidence. You'll need to come with us immediately." As the handcuffs clicked into place, Thornfield looked up with something approaching relief. 30 years of looking over my shoulder, of fearing every advance in forensic photography, every new method of analysis. Perhaps prison will be preferable to that particular form of perpetual anxiety. Later, as we prepared to leave Grosvenor House, Poirot paused before the damaged photograph one final time. "The truth, Hastings, is like light itself. It may be refracted, reflected, or temporarily obscured, but it cannot be permanently destroyed. Even the most sophisticated deception contains within itself the seeds of its own inevitable revelation." "And the photograph?" I inquired. "Will be preserved as evidence, though its artistic value is forever compromised." Poirot adjusted his tie with characteristic precision. "Perhaps that is fitting. Truth and beauty are not always compatible, but truth is invariably more valuable." As we stepped into the London morning, I reflected on the curious affair of the photograph that lied, and how one man's desperate attempt to conceal the truth had ultimately ensured its discovery.